Welcome to our deep dive into the life of Su Shi. You might have seen his name in a textbook, but trust me, folks, there's so much more to him than just a quick mention. We'll be exploring some fascinating excerpts from a text that details his life, and wow, it is quite a story.
It really is. What's so striking is how Su Shi embodies the idea of a Renaissance man.
Hmm.
I mean, we're talking about someone who excelled at poetry, calligraphy, painting, but it goes beyond that. Government, even cooking.
Yeah, no, that's what really caught my attention too, the sheer range of his accomplishments. So he's founding this bold new style of poetry, right? He becomes one of the four masters of calligraphy in the
Mm.
Northern Song Dynasty, and then invents the ink bamboo painting style. That's not just being talented, that's like next level genius.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And, what's great about this deep dive is that we're not just going to list off his achievements. We're going to try and uncover, reveal the person behind them. You'll see that even with all this genius, Su Shi faced very human challenges,
Mm.
and he had these surprisingly relatable ways of overcoming them.
I like that. It makes him seem much more, well, human? So, where do we even begin? I guess our text points to the huge influence of Sushi's father, Su Sun, right?
Right. Susun was a scholar himself, but never quite reached that high-ranking government position he wanted. And you'd think maybe the story goes he pushes his own dreams on his son, right? But with Susun, no, quite the opposite. He really fostered and nurtured Sushi's own natural love of learning.
I love that. Encouragement instead of pressure. That's fantastic. And there's this little detail in the text that mentions young Sushi being obsessed with history books. Makes total sense when you think about how he later weaves those historical references into his writing, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And what's really cool? Susun, he had this really unique teaching method to make sure his students really understood the classic texts. He would have them, get this, unpunctuated versions of them. Can you imagine if your teacher did that?
That's amazing. Talk about turning rote memorization into an active learning experience. Makes you think about how education can be so much more engaging when it's about understanding, not just memorizing facts.
Exactly. And that solid foundation in both history and this act of learning really shaped Sushi's own journey.
So, with this, love of learning from his dad,
Mm.
Sushi comes across the work of Shu, this literary superstar at the time. Now, most people would be intimidated, right? But Sushi, no, he was inspired.
It's such a pivotal moment, I think, because it reveals a lot about Sushi's mindset. He saw Yangshu's success, and instead of thinking, oh, I could never do that, he thought, if this guy can do it, so can I. Recognizing potential and not being
Yeah.
limited, right?
Yeah, that's so true. It's that moment where you realize greatness isn't something mystical. It's about dedication, it's hard work, it's believing in yourself. Did you ever have a moment like that where someone else's success kind of spurred you on?
Oh, definitely. And for Sushi, this inspiration fueled his preparation for the imperial examinations.
Mm.
Those are the intense tests in ancient China that basically decided your future.
Oh, man. And I thought my exams were stressful. We're talking about copying whole history books, mastering complex texts, not to mention, acing those punctuation exercises his dad drilled into him. Talk about dedication.
Right. And then the exams themselves were, well, intense is an understatement. Imagine being locked in a tiny room guarded by palace guards, and you can't leave until you're done. Talk about pressure.
This is where the story gets wild. Remember Sushi's literary hero, Shu? Guess who ends up as the chief examiner?
Fate works in mysterious ways, doesn't it?
Hmm.
And because of the strict rules to keep things fair, Wu Yangshu almost didn't even recognize his own student's brilliance. In fact, he almost gave first place to someone else, thought Sushi's essay was too good, figured it must have been written by his friend Zhang Gong.
Wow. Can you imagine being denied top honors because you're just too good? It's like something out of a movie.
It really is. And, one thing that stuck out to me from Sushi's essay was this argument that a ruler should approach both rewards and punishments with the same kind of loyal heart. It really gives you a peek into his values, how he viewed leadership.
So remember how Sushi did all that prep, read tons of history books? Well, he got a little creative in his essay.
You mean the made-up historical illusion?
Yeah.
Sushi just casually invented this whole story about Emperor Yao and a judge, slipped it right into his essay.
And get this, the examiners were so impressed by his knowledge that they didn't question it at all. Probably too afraid to look dumb, right?
It's hilarious and such a testament to his confidence in his storytelling. And when they finally realized, he made it up, his response, classic. I made it up myself.
And instead of being furious, Ouyang Zhu was delighted, saw it as the sign of Su Shi's creativity and wit. I mean, this was a time where scholarship and proper conduct were everything.
It's true. And that incident really solidified their teacher-student bond. Wing Shu was so impressed that he said, "After reading Su Shi's articles, I think I should give my place to him. 30 years later, no one in the world will talk about me." Basically saying Su Shi was going to be even more famous than him.
Talk about a mentor's ultimate seal of approval. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. But as you'll see, Su Shi's journey wasn't all smooth sailing.
Right. Just as things were going so well, tragedy strikes. Su Shi's mother passes away, and he has to return home for the traditional 3-year mourning period.
So sad. And during this time, a massive political shift is happening back in the capital, Wang Anshi's reforms.
Exactly.
For those of us who need a refresher, can you give us, like, the quick version of these reforms?
Well, Wang Anshi was trying to fix some serious problems in the Song dynasty. Struggling economy, weak military. His reforms were meant to increase government revenue and strengthen defenses.
Right. But they were pretty controversial, weren't they?
Oh, definitely. They split the court right down the middle, those who supported the reforms and those who were completely against them. And Su Shi, being Su Shi, independent thinker, he was right in the middle.
So which side was he on?
He wasn't really on either side, I think he recognized that change was needed, but he saw how the reforms were hurting everyday people, more of a moderate voice urging caution.
Yeah, which probably didn't make him very popular with the reform enthusiasts.
Nope. And facing this backlash, Su Shi made a big decision to leave the prestige and power of the capital. He chose to serve as an official in more rural areas instead.
So he's putting his principles and his desire to truly serve the people above his own ambition.
Absolutely. It really speaks to his character and his commitment to doing what he believed was right, even if it meant sacrificing, his own career goals.
Now we come to one of Su Shi's most famous stories, his time as governor in Mizzou and this epic battle against a devastating locust plague.
Imagine it. Swarms of locusts darkening the sky, crops being completely devoured, people facing starvation, a real crisis.
And this is where Su Shi really shines. Instead of just hiding in his office, he gets out there, rolls up his sleeves.
He petitioned for tax relief for the farmers, rallied the people, and even went out there himself to observe and learn the best extermination techniques. They were using fire, burying techniques, and he was right there with them.
And the text mentions how his feet got blistered from all the work. That just shows how dedicated he was to helping people.
It does. He was a leader who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and it earned him so much respect.
From scholar to locust-battling hero. Now, speaking of problem-solving, his time in Hangzhou shows a whole other side of his ingenuity. Remember the West Lake?
Oh yeah, not exactly the beauty spot it is today. Back then it was overgrown, silted up, basically becoming a wasteland.
But the lake wasn't just about looks. It was vital to Hangzhou. It provided water, irrigation, fish, even stuff for brewing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Su Shi gets this right away. He comes up with this plan to dredge it and build a causeway to get the water flowing.
And of course, he's hands-on, getting funding, working with laborers, and then comes the story of the Goryeo monks.
Oh, right. They needed red soil from a temple for the causeway, but the monks said no way, believed it would bring a curse.
Classic Su Shi move. He offers himself as a sacrifice, says, hey, if there's a curse, put my statue in the temple, let it fall on me.
That's Su Shi for you. Brave and dedicated. And the amazing thing is, you can still see his work today, the Su Causeway. That's all thanks to him thinking outside the box.
And who could forget that iconic poem comparing the West Lake to a beautiful woman? Light makeup and thick colors are always suitable. Beautiful imagery.
It's perfect.
Okay, so we've got political turmoil, locusts, saving the West Lake, and all this poetry. You'd think life would give him a break, right?
Not exactly. This is where things take a turn for the worse. Su Shi gets transferred to Huzhou, sends this routine thank you letter to the emperor for the new position, and gets arrested.
What? A thank you note gets him thrown in jail. That just doesn't make any sense. What could be so offensive about saying thank you?
You're not going to believe this. Well, it all comes back to the political climate. I mean, those reforms by Wang Anshi had caused some serious rifts. Anyone who was even a little bit critical of the emperor or his policies, well, it just wasn't looked upon very favorably.
So what exactly was so bad about this letter? Was Su Shi secretly dissing the emperor or something?
Not really. It was more that those in power were, let's just say, on edge. and they were looking for anything to use against Su Shi. And let's not forget, he'd already ruffled some feathers with the die-hard reform supporters.
So they were taking his words and twisting them, trying to make it look like he was being disrespectful.
That's it, exactly. They accused him of using sneaky language to make fun of the reforms and undermine the emperor, like they were reading things into his words that weren't even there.
So basically, he's getting in trouble for something he didn't even say.
It shows you how tricky politics can be and how important context is. Sadly for Su Shi, the context wasn't in his favor.
All right, so they arrested him, took him back to the capital. What happened next?
Well, things kind of blew up from there. This whole thing became known as the Crow Terrace poetry case. And Su Shi spent months locked up in prison, interrogation after interrogation, you know. They were poring over his poetry, trying to find some evidence of treason or anything anti-government.
Hold on a minute. They're going after him for his poetry now. That seems a bit extreme.
Well, you got to remember, back then, poetry was huge in China, culturally and politically. It wasn't just about expressing feelings. It could be a way to talk about issues, criticize those in power, even spark revolution.
So Su Shi's poems, even if they weren't directly about politics, were seen as a threat because they could be interpreted in ways that challenged those in power.
Exactly. And don't forget, his writing was famous for being bold and new, so it made him a target. People thought there were hidden meanings, rebellious intentions.
Wow, it's like they used his own creativity against him.
It's pretty ironic when you think about it, but it does show how much power art can have. It can be celebrated, but it can also be seen as dangerous.
So what was the verdict? Did they find anything in his poems?
Well, they tried everything, pressured him to confess, but they couldn't actually pin anything concrete on him. Most of the accusations were just like flimsy interpretations or straight-up personal vendettas.
So they let him go.
Not quite. Even without solid proof, they still found him guilty. The sentence? Exile.
Seriously, all that for essentially what? A thought crime? That's rough.
It was pretty harsh. But you have to understand the political situation at the time. The emperor probably felt he had to make an example out of Su Shi, even if he wasn't totally convinced Su Shi was actually guilty.
Right, so it was a show of power, like a warning to anyone else thinking about criticizing the reforms or questioning the emperor.
Exactly, a classic power move to squash any disagreement.
So where did they send Su Shi? Some terrible remote place.
First, he was sent to Huangzhou. Compared to the capital, it was, pretty rural, a big fall from grace for sure. But, as we'll see, Su Shi was resilient. He even found inspiration during his exile.
So it wasn't exactly a nice vacation, but it wasn't a prison either.
Right. He had some limits on what he could do, where he could go, and money was tight. But he could still write, spend time in nature, reflect on his life.
I guess after everything he'd been through, a simpler life might have been a welcome change.
It really is all about perspective. And despite this situation, Su Shi never stopped seeing the beauty around him, the humor, the meaning in life.
That's what I find so amazing, this resilience. He could have just gotten bitter and angry, but instead he channels his experiences into his writing, his art, his life.
He reminds us that we all have a choice in how we react to tough situations. We can let them defeat us, or we can see them as an opportunity for growth.
So here's Su Shi in Huangzhou trying to make the best of things. What was this exile life really like? How did he spend his time?
Well, this is where we see a new side of Su Shi. Farmer, naturalist, you could even say culinary innovator. Remember dung po pork?
Wait, are we talking about the dung po pork, the famous dish?
That's the one. Legend says Su Shi was experimenting with cooking pork during his exile, and bam, the dish named after his pen name Dung Po was created.
This is amazing. So he's writing poetry, painting, and creating amazing pork dishes. This guy never stops.
He was a man of many talents, and it shows how he could find joy and purpose even in the simplest things.
Was this exile like forever? Did he ever get back to the capital or get his job back?
Oh, his fate was tied to the crazy world of politics. So there were times when he was brought back, given important jobs, actually using his talents to help people. But just when things were looking up, bam, new accusations, demotions, all because he spoke his mind and had connections to people who didn't like the reforms.
It sounds exhausting. It's like he was trapped between his talents and his principles. One minute a celebrated scholar, the next a political outcast.
It makes you wonder, what if he had, compromised a bit, played the game? But then, well, that wouldn't have been the Su Shi we know, right?
That's very true. It's his integrity, his willingness to stand up for what he believed in, even when it cost him, that makes him so interesting.
And through all this turmoil and change, you never really see Su Shi completely broken. He never stopped writing, creating, finding those little moments of beauty and connection.
It's like he understood that life has its ups and downs, and that finding meaning and purpose in everything, even the tough times, is where true happiness comes from.
A good lesson for us all.
So Sushi's in exile, trying new recipes, still writing, but what about his art? Did he paint during this time?
He did, and his time in Hangzhou actually shows a change in his style. He started to focus more on landscapes, nature scenes. It reflects this new appreciation he had for the simplicity and beauty of the world around him.
So his art became like a way to show what he was going through, finding peace in the chaos.
There's this famous quote from him. He said, "I am not fond of painting flowers and birds, but I am very fond of painting landscapes." And he explained how these landscapes allowed him to express a sense of vastness and freedom, which, I mean, doing his exile, that must have been really appealing.
Breaking free through his art, that's powerful.
And his landscapes, they're not just about capturing what he saw, they're full of emotion, philosophical ideas. His brushstrokes, the way he uses ink, it all conveys his feelings about life, loss, searching for meaning.
It's hard to imagine how he could take ink and paper and make it so profound, so full of emotion.
It shows you the power of art, how it can help us connect to something deeper in ourselves and in the world.
So Sushi's painting, he's cooking, figuring out how to deal with exile, but I get the feeling there's more to the story. What happens next in this crazy life of his?
Well, you're right. Sushi's life, it never really settles down. It's this constant back and forth. Sometimes he's in favor, given these important positions, big projects, really using his talents to help people. But then, just when it seems like things are going well, bam, more accusations, demotions, usually because, well, he wouldn't back down. Always speaking his mind. Plus, he had those connections to the people who were against those reforms.
It's like he couldn't catch a break, right? Up and down, up and down. Did it ever get to him, do you think? All this uncertainty and stress?
You definitely see it sometimes, yeah, in his later writing. A little bit of like weariness, a sense of being disillusioned. But the amazing thing is he never completely loses his spirit. He keeps that belief in human connection and creativity.
So even after all that, the exile, the hardship, he still finds a way to express himself, make a difference. It's inspiring, really.
Well, it is. And you know what? Some of his most powerful work, his most moving stuff, it comes from those periods of exile. It's almost like he took those personal struggles and turned them into something universal, something we can all relate to.
That's powerful, turning difficult experiences into something beautiful, meaningful, something that still speaks to people, centuries later.
That's the power of art, right?
Yeah.
Sushi's work still resonates with us because it speaks to those things that are always relevant. Resilience, hope, finding meaning in a world that, well, can feel pretty chaotic sometimes.
Okay, so we've covered his poetry, his calligraphy, his painting, the cooking even, his wild career in politics, the multiple exiles. Is there anything else this guy did? I'm starting to think he had like a time machine or something.
Well, he also wrote a ton of prose. Essays, philosophical stuff. He was a master of language, could take these complex ideas and express them so clearly, with wit, too.
So not only was he creating all this art, but he was also writing these insightful essays and philosophical works. Seriously, how did he have the time?
It's a good question, right? I think part of it was just pure brilliance, and he had this endless energy. But it also feels like he had this deep need to express himself, to connect with the world.
Like he needed to be creative, like it was essential to him.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I think we can take away from Sushi, that belief in the power of the human spirit. The ability to overcome anything, find beauty and meaning, even in the toughest times.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Sushi's incredible life, what are the big takeaways here? What can we learn from him?
Resilience, definitely. Sushi faced so many setbacks, so many disappointments, but he never gave up on his passions, on his belief in people. He learned to adapt, to grow, to keep creating, even when it felt like the whole world was against him.
It's like he knew life would be tough and that the important thing was being able to bounce back, learn from it all, and keep going, even when you're not sure what's next.
Another thing, I think, is the importance of embracing all the different sides of ourselves. Sushi wasn't just one thing, right? He was a poet, an artist, a politician, and so much more. He found happiness in exploring all those parts of himself and the world around him.
It's a good reminder that we don't have to limit ourselves. We can be complex, always changing, and passionate about lots of things. What are you passionate about? Is there something you've always wanted to try? Maybe Sushi's story can inspire you to give it a shot.
And one last thing I think is really important is the power of creativity. It can be a source of comfort, connection, a way to find meaning. Su Shi turned to art, to writing, to nature, to deal with everything life threw at him. He found beauty in those tough times and connected to something larger than himself.
It wasn't just about making pretty things, was it? It was about understanding the world, expressing those deep feelings, connecting to something beyond the everyday.
And that's something we can all do, in our own way, no matter what our background is, or even if we don't think of ourselves as artists. We all have that creative spark inside. We can use it to make our lives better, richer. What brings you joy? What sparks your imagination? How can you nurture that creative part of yourself?
Beautifully said. So there you have it, Su Shi. So much more than a name in a textbook. A man of incredible talent, resilience, and a deep appreciation for the beauty and the challenges of life.
His story reminds us that even when things are tough, we can choose to be resilient, to be creative, to never stop looking for that beauty and meaning in the world. And hey, who knows? Maybe this deep dive will inspire you to go make some dongpo pork and discover your own inner Renaissance person.
That's a great idea. Thanks for joining us for this depth dive into the world of sushi. We'll see you next time for another journey into, well, whatever fascinating topic awaits.